investing by 2015 $55 billion a year into China.
That Apple's entire supply chain rests on China. So they depend on China. That's where their bread is buttered.
2015, over $55 billion a year into China. That's right. Every single year, tens of billions were flowing from one of the world's most powerful tech giants straight into a country that's now America's most formidable rival. Apple's entire supply chain rests on China. They depend on it. That's where their bread is buttered, their products, their profits, their production lines, all of it hinges on Chinese labor, infrastructure, and support. So how exactly did the biggest tech company in the world end up turning America's key rival into the technological and military superpower it is today? The answer is as shocking as it is eye-opening. Apple has effectively been captured by the CCP. Right now, about 90% of iPhones are made in China. Just imagine that, 9 out of 10 iPhones, those sleek devices in our pockets, are born in Chinese factories. Apple knows that at any moment, Xi Jinping, the president of China, can quite literally cripple the company. And to make things worse, Apple isn't even allowed to freely leave. It can't just pack up and move to another country. But here's where the story takes a twist. Apple knew this all along. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a surprise. In fact, they're one of the biggest actors propping up the Chinese regime, investing hundreds of billions into the country in a way no other private company has ever done before. $55 billion a year since 2015. That adds up to over $500 billion in the last decade alone. To put that in perspective, that's more than 10 times the size of the US government's CHIPS Act, or Trump's entire Golden Dome initiative. It's an enormous sum of money. You know what? Nothing quite says. Designed in California. Like sending $500 billion to Beijing. So, let's take a step back and try to understand how Apple got into this situation. Because in 1999, not a single Apple product was made in China. Zero. Apple wasn't even selling its products in China. But fast forward just 10 years later, and virtually every Apple device was being manufactured in China, and the Chinese market had become one of Apple's largest. Now, before we go further, a serious disclaimer. This topic is sensitive, very sensitive. Especially for the Chinese Communist Party. That's why the mainstream media tends to avoid it. It's a story very few are willing to talk about. So if you're watching this, please hit the like and subscribe button. It genuinely helps. YouTube's algorithm doesn't always favor videos like this, videos that challenge the status quo or criticize powerful regimes. But even a single like can push this video a little further and help get this truth out. Alright, back to the story. This shift begins in 1996. That year, Apple was staring down bankruptcy. The company had just posted a $740 million loss, which, adjusted for inflation, is roughly $1.5 billion today. They were literally days away from not being able to pay their bills. Apple had even hired a Chapter 11 bankruptcy lawyer. Hard to believe. When we look at Apple today, but back then, things were dire. The company was struggling in the computer business, losing to Microsoft and others in a PC market that was being flooded by cheap, standardized Windows machines. This was also the time when Apple literally sold off the bite of the apple in their logo, a symbolic moment that hinted at desperation. The market was filled with PCs that used interchangeable components. And this gave rise to a new business model, electronics contract manufacturing. In other words, companies outsourced their production to third-party factories that could build products at a massive scale and for much lower costs. These manufacturers eventually moved abroad to countries where wages were cheaper. But Apple initially resisted this trend. Steve Jobs believed in making things in-house. Their designs were complex, unique, and hard to replicate. That meant most Apple products were built in Apple-owned factories, like the one in Fremont, California. But as a result, Apple's prices skyrocketed. They couldn't keep up. Something had to change. So, Apple started experimenting. In 1980, they opened their first foreign factory in Ireland. Then in 1981, they set up shop in Singapore. That same year, They started working with an American third-party contractor, SCI Systems. But they still didn't fully commit. In 1991, Apple opened a new factory in Colorado, again owned and operated by Apple. And it still wasn't working. The business was bleeding cash. That's when Apple finally changed course. After almost going bankrupt, they decided to think differently, but maybe not too differently. After brief trials in Mexico, they followed other American companies to Asia. But China wasn't the destination yet. Back then, it was still poor, underdeveloped, and deeply communist. Instead, Apple turned to booming economies like South Korea and Taiwan. They signed contracts with South Korea's LG to make displays. They also worked with Taiwanese companies like Quanta Computer and Inventec to assemble products. Later on, Taiwan's TSMC, which you've probably heard of, would become Apple's exclusive chip supplier. But the real game changer was a company called Foxconn, or as it's officially known, Han High Precision Industry. Founded by a man named Terry Gou, or Uncle Terry as he's often called, Foxconn would go on to become one of the largest companies in the world. And it didn't just grow on its own. It played a massive role in building up China's economy. In 1987, Taiwan lifted martial law, allowing businessmen to trade with mainland China again, ending a 38-year freeze since the Chinese Civil War. Around the same time, China began opening up to free market reforms under Deng Xiaoping. Uncle Terry seized the moment. He built a sprawling empire of factories across China, especially in Shenzhen, where a city of nearly 500,000 workers would eventually spring up around Foxconn. With support from the Chinese government, in the form of tax exemptions, loose regulations, state bank loans, free land, and even direct investments, Foxconn exploded in size. They were allowed to exploit workers in ways that would never fly elsewhere. People from rural areas flooded into cities to work in brutal conditions, 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, sleeping in crowded dorms, earning 50 cents an hour. No human rights. No labor protections. No unions. It was in this context that Apple found its perfect manufacturing partner. Foxconn got its first contract in 2000, assembling iMac G3s. Then came the iPod in 2003, the Mac Mini in 2005, and MacBooks in 2006. But everything changed in 2007. Apple launched the iPhone, and Foxconn went all in. They built towering factories, betting that this device would change the world. And they were right. The iPhone became Apple's biggest cash cow, and Foxconn got a near monopoly on assembling them. From that point on, Apple's entire business leaned on China. Foxconn became a manufacturing juggernaut. China's GDP ballooned. Apple's profits soared. But so did their dependency. By 2015, China was not just Apple's factory, it was also one of its biggest markets, contributing nearly $60 billion in revenue, a full 25% of Apple's global business. Then came the backlash. Reports of suicides at Foxconn. Child labor under the disguise of internships. Workers driven to the brink. Apple installed nets around factories to prevent people from jumping. Yes, actual nets. And instead of addressing the core issue, they released reports and PR statements. But the real turning point came when Xi Jinping took power in 2013. The Chinese media immediately launched an attack on Apple, claiming they offered inferior warranties to Chinese customers. It wasn't even true. Many resellers in China were fake stores posing as Apple. But the CCP didn't care. This was a power move. Apple's new CEO, Tim Cook, caved. He issued a public apology, praised China, and even introduced a better warranty policy in China than in America. This was a message. Xi Jinping was going to tighten control. Foreign companies were under scrutiny. In 2014, over 30 foreign firms, including Qualcomm, faced investigations. Qualcomm was hit with $1 billion fine and forced to enter joint ventures with Chinese firms that would later steal their tech. Apple knew it had to act. So it created an internal group, the Gang of Eight, focused solely on managing CCP relations. Their goal? To help China achieve its strategic goals. And that's exactly what Apple did. By 2015, Apple was investing $55 billion a year into China. That's more than the US CHIPS Act. More than the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe. It's unprecedented. Apple trained 28 million Chinese workers, including engineers. They sent their best US engineers to China, building up the country's human capital. And they built an entire supply chain under CCP control, what's now called the Red Supply Chain. All of this helped China close the gap with America, not just economically, but militarily. As Alexander Hamilton once said, manufacturing is key to both wealth and national security. The machines that make iPhones can also make drones and missiles. The engineers Apple trained? They can build defense tech too. And Apple went even further. In 2017, they removed VPNs from the Chinese App Store, helping the CCP strengthen its firewall. They removed the New York Times app, moved Chinese user data into state-controlled data centers. Later, they removed WhatsApp, Threads, Bible apps, even AirDrop was restricted during protests. But now, Apple is facing a crisis. Geopolitical tensions are rising. Trump imposed tariffs. There's talk of a US-China conflict, maybe even over Taiwan. And Apple is vulnerable. Their chips come from TSMC in Taiwan. Their supply chain is embedded in China. If conflict breaks out, Apple is done. To mitigate this, Apple is trying to diversify, moving some assembly to India and Vietnam. Shipments from India reached $2 billion recently. But that's just assembly, the final step. The supply chain is still stuck in China. Worse, China is actively blocking Apple from moving its own machines out of the country. Machines that Apple owns, but China controls the door. And even if they could move them, training a new workforce in India or Vietnam would take years. And if Apple tries to leave, there's a real risk the CCP will just steal everything, from machinery to intellectual property. Some say they already have. Apple recently announced a $500 billion investment in the US. Sounds great, but it's mostly PR. Just 20,000 new jobs. That's $25 million per job. They've made similar promises before. In 2021. In 2018. Always 20,000 jobs. Nothing substantial changes. Because truthfully, bringing production back to the US isn't feasible, not yet. Wages are too high. Labor is scarce. Infrastructure is lacking. Maybe robotics will help in the future. But right now, Apple is trapped. For now, and for the foreseeable future, Apple has a massive China problem. That's it from my side on this topic. If you found this video interesting or insightful, please give it a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss an update about the forces shaping our world. Also, do let me know about your views by commenting below. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and see you in the next one.